Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel, where today we are going to be doing a full-length, non-spoilery review of the 13 Days of Halloween, the second season. So yes, this review is going to focus only on the second season. I will be making mention of the first season for comparison, especially when we're talking about improvements, but it is a review of only the second season. If you are interested in a review of the first season, I have already done one of those and I will leave it linked down below. So, if you do not know, the 13 Days of Halloween is a horror short story podcast. Each season has 13 episodes that are released between October 19th and October 31st, with one episode being released each day. Each episode is between 15 and 25 minutes, although they do stick pretty close to the 20-minute mark. And in this season, we are following a young woman who is washed up on shore, and she has no memories, total amnesia. She is found by Mother, who kind of takes her in and takes her back to the local village of Dyrebrook, where she helps take care of this young woman, get her warmed up and fed, and the bump on her head looked at. But she is also doing errands around town to get ready for the gathering that is supposed to happen that evening in the town. But as they are going around the town, they meet some of the residents of Dyrebrook, and every resident has a story to tell. So, each episode has a pretty straightforward, simplistic structure. We are at the beginning given the warning that listener discretion is advised, and also that you should probably use headphones for full effect. I very much recommend using headphones or being in an enclosed space like a car, because this is 3D audio. It really helps with immersion to have the headphones or be in an enclosed space. Anyway, after that warning, we transition into the episode. At the very beginning, we do have some conversation between the young woman and Mother. Frequently, they're walking to their next destination, and Mother will kind of give these little vignette type stories or warnings, or just kind of explain how things work around the town. And then they will get to their destination. Mother will kind of introduce the resident. The resident will start talking to the young woman, and it will very nicely transition into the short story of the day. After the resident is done telling the short story, then we transition out, and Mother kind of takes the young woman in hand as they move on to their next destination. After that, the episode more or less ends, although there is after that there is a preview for the episode for the next day. So, for the kind of design of this particular podcast, I think that having the Mother character, who is kind of like a primary narrator, she is the one that is moving us and the young woman along to the various destinations and introducing us to the residents who are going to be telling the stories and pushing the overarching narrative of the season forward, is a great choice. We had this in the first season with the caretaker, and I'm really happy that they left it in, because all of these little vignettes and warnings really helps set the mood for being in Dyrebrook, this kind of dilapidated, old school kind of town. You just get that feeling, and it's great. It really helps set the mood before we get this horror short story. And I think it is really, really effective in setting that mood. One thing that I did notice that was much better than the first season is the transitions into and out of the episode. Each season they have used sound effects to signal the beginning of the episode and the end of the episode. But in the first season, it was very short. This season, they let it go on a little bit longer, and I think that is much, much more effective as a transition. The other thing that was a huge improvement on the first season is ad placement. So, in this particular season, like the first half, I actually didn't have any ads. Now I am listening on Spotify, the free version of Spotify, so I do get ads. But I didn't notice any in the first half. And once I did get ads in the second half, it was actually after the episode was already over. So after we had like Mother had already taken the young woman on to the next destination. We had our transitional sound effect, and then it was the ad. And so I never felt like I was being ripped out of this immersive experience like I did with the first season. So I'm really, really happy that they made that particular change. One change that they made that I think had a slightly negative effect is that instead of having the audience being a participatory character within this series, we had the young woman who was much more of a stand-in for the audience. And so in the first season, like the caretaker and the residents of the manor would all interact with the listener. And in this season, we didn't, because the listener just isn't a character in this particular story. And so what that ended up doing is it meant that the audience was no longer centered in this story, which kind of changes how the audio was utilized. So, for example, in the first season, the caretaker would walk up to you because you are the character that he is talking to. But you could hear like the footsteps coming up behind you and like come alongside, and then he would start speaking. And so it really felt like you were there. And with this one, we don't have those kinds of things where you, the listener, are centered within the audio. And I think that that subtle kind of change really affected how immersive this season was. I felt like I never could fully get sucked in because I wasn't part of the story. I was an observer of the story. And again, very subtle kind of shift. And I found it to be a little bit I found it to be very, very noticeable, and it really affected my experience, but your mileage may vary. I do understand why they put the young woman character in there, which we'll talk about when we get to the writing. But unfortunately, I do think it had an overall slightly negative effect on the audio immersion of this season. So, talking about the acting, and actually, I don't have much to say because overall, the acting was really good. On par, like for each episode, it was just nicely done. All of the actors seem to understand, the storytellers, the residents, all seem to understand that these were intended to be oral stories, that this person is like telling a story from their life. And so that's kind of how they acted it. And that's how it came across. And it was great. I didn't notice any standout performances among the storytellers, either good or bad. They were just overall good. The main character of Mother is played by Kathy Najimy, and the young woman is played by Bethany Ann Lind, and they both did great in their roles, and they also had very nice chemistry with each other. So yeah, overall the acting was great. So let's talk about the writing and the storytelling aspects of this season. I am not going to talk about whether this is actually scary or not, because with horror, it's always a your mileage may vary. And so I don't find it particularly helpful to talk about that aspect of it. But we're just going to talk about the quality of the writing. So, going back to having that young woman character who is kind of the audience stand-in, I think that this choice was made because it made the transitions so much smoother. So the thing is, in the first season, having the listener be a character in the story meant that people were talking to you. And you can make that work, but you have to have great writing and great acting. Otherwise, it's going to come across very, very clunky. And that's exactly what happened in the first season. But because in the second season we had the character of the young woman who was able to respond and have an actual dialogue with these residents, it just flowed so much smoother. It felt so much more natural. And it didn't even honestly feel like a transition most of the time. So I think that this was just done so much better this season. I completely understand why this character was introduced because it did really help with those transitions. As for the overarching story that we had in this season, I didn't particularly care for it. I didn't think it was bad. I just didn't have a ton of feelings, honestly, overall. So the wrap up of the overarching story that happens in the 13th episode, I was just kind of like, okay, it's kind of meh. But also just each episode, the what we got that was kind of pushing that overarching story forward, I also found it to be just not that intriguing. I didn't find it that interesting. I didn't find it that intriguing. Mostly it kind of fell into very familiar territory. So I kind of knew what to expect when we got to the reveals. And also because I didn't feel any specific connection with the young woman or mother, like when we got to the reveals, I knew what it was going to be, and I didn't care about the impact that it was going to have on the characters because I didn't feel any particular connection to these characters. And so, like, when we got to the reveals, it was just kind of like, yeah, let's move it along, which is not exactly what you want from a person who is consuming your story. So that's not great. And it was actually a little bit sad because I found the overarching story for the first season to be very intriguing, very mysterious, and it kept me coming back to each episode. So, um, each individual story, I think in some ways was written much better. So it was much more consistent that each short story was written as an oral story. So this is something I had a problem with in the first season where some of the stories felt much more like it was a short story, a written short story that was just being read aloud rather than an oral story. But this season, it was much more consistent that each of them were written to be oral stories. And so it just helped feel much more natural that these residents would be telling you these things. However, I found all of the stories to just be similar to the overarching story. It just wasn't that particularly intriguing or interesting or imaginative, honestly. So even when there were unique aspects to each story, mostly the story fell into much more familiar territory and it kind of overpowered that unique aspect. And so I knew what to expect. I kind of knew where each story was going. And so, like, you can make that work. You can, when the audience knows where the story is going, you can actually make that work because it can heighten the tension to know what's coming and you're just waiting for it to happen. And if an author knows that that's what's going through the audience, they can like play with that and make it more tense. But unfortunately, that's not what we had with any of these short stories. So it just felt kind of meh, like I just didn't, I knew what was going to happen. And part of this has to do with the fact that I found every story to have some amount of pacing issues. So this was probably the most notable in the story we got from the butcher shop. The butcher shop story fell into very familiar territory. I knew what we were going to be going towards. And when we were getting there, I was just like, okay, this is where the story is going to slow down. We're really going to build that tension because we know this reveal is happening and it's going to really, make the audience tense to slow down. And we didn't. Instead, we just breezed past this big reveal. And I was like, what? Because the whole thing is like when you breeze past it, it's not scary anymore. And so it was just very honestly strange that we had so many pacing issues with these stories. Some it was very minor, some it was a lot more major. All of them had some kind of pacing issues though. However, I will say there is one big caveat to this, and that is I do not get scared from horror stuff. I don't really get tense from horror stuff. Even really immersive, atmospheric kind of horror doesn't really affect me. So the thing is, I am pointing out these story issues, but you may find that you don't have any issues with these stories because you're so immersed and it's like very tense from, the audio and what's going on. I didn't feel any of that. And when all of that is stripped away, it's much easier to see the problems within the stories. So, like, your mileage may vary, but that is what I noticed as somebody who does not generally get scared from horror. So, overall, I found that there were significant improvements to this podcast over the first season, but unfortunately, it was overshadowed by the fact that none of these stories were all that interesting, honestly. And so, I found the writing to be the biggest problem with this season, and I ended up giving it 3 stars because really I have listened to every episode in the last 2 weeks and I don't remember really any of the stories. And like, there was nothing that was absolutely pulling me into listening to all of the episodes. So, 3 stars. But the improvements that were made over the first season really gives me hope that if they do a third season, that they are going to continue to improve. So I would be absolutely game to try a third season of this particular podcast. But that is it. If you have any thoughts or feelings about anything that I have said in this review, please leave me a comment down below. But that is it for this video. So if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. And until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.